Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I thank you for joining us for this episode. Today, we are going to be talking about death, but not in the usual ways we do on this podcast. There will be little discussion of the paranormal and no mention of grisly murders, unsolved or otherwise. Instead, we will be looking into the lives and businesses of those who spend the most time with the dead, Undertakers. Joining us will be historical researcher and author Marion Roes to talk about her new book, Death as Life's Work, which focuses on undertakers and funeral businesses in the Waterloo, Ontario region from 1850 to 2020. Marion will be sharing with us some of the practices that have changed in the industry over the years, surprising artifacts she unearthed during her research, and her family's unique experience of operating a funeral home for over 100 years. But before we get to that, I have to admit, I am pretty excited as our first live virtual haunted campfire of 2022 is just days away, and we have a great collection of storytellers from around the world who will be joining us. Up first, on February 5th, 2022, we head to Washington, D.C. for an evening of ghost stories about the White House and Capitol Hill from our friends at National Nightmares, LLC. Then, on February 12th, we head to the beautiful and haunted mountains of Banff, Alberta, led by our guide from the Banff Canmore Ghost Walk. Other stops will include Ashland, Virginia, Edinburgh, Scotland, and Hollywood, California, just to name a few. These shows are always a lot of fun, and I would love for you to join us. Tickets are only $14.99 Canadian or $12 US per device, so a fun, spooky, and affordable night that is also a great way to support Haunted Talks, the Haunted Walk, and haunted creators from around the world. Information on all 8 of our campfires can be found on our website, hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. 2 other really easy and helpful ways you can let us know you're out there and enjoying the show is to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us, and to recommend Haunted Talks to friends, family, random strangers on the internet, or anyone you think would enjoy it. It is my pleasure to welcome Marion Roes to the show. Marion, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, we're going to be talking about your new book, Death as Life's Work. But I think perhaps the interesting backstory to your research is a little of your family history. And when I think about funeral homes, particularly as a youngster, they were places of wonder maybe, or fear or uncertainty, very uncommon, I guess, in kind of day-to-day life. And as an adult, I don't really know if that's changed too much for me. Now, your family has been involved in the business for a great many years. And I wonder if you could fill us in a little bit on your family history related to funeral and undertaking practices.
My great-grandfather was Christian Dreisinger, and in 1904, he bought an undertaking business in Elmira that had been established, and then he went on and added the furniture store to it. So He had that business in Elmira, and 3 more generations followed him. There was his son, but then my uncle and my mother and my sister. And she's been licensed for 53 years now and is the last one in the family that still works at the funeral home. It's been sold a couple of times. Some of what started me was in this book and researching a while back was I found out that my great-grandfather, he was partnered with a business in Waterloo and in Kitchener that I didn't know about. So I grew up being familiar with the furniture store, the funeral home. They were combined in one building for most of the time. We would go there after school when I was younger. As I was older, I wasn't there as much, but I was familiar with the big black cars. They were always clean because a clean car runs better, according to my funeral director uncle. Seeing bodies in caskets, and it was just part of my personal life, but not my work life. The rest of my family worked in the two businesses, but I never did. And then in 1977, the funeral home and the furniture store divided, and the funeral home moved to another location, still in the family, but a separate ownership. And from then, I was mostly removed from it until I became interested in researching about the history.
I do have a couple follow-up questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is just about the combination of the furniture store and the funeral home. Was this a common practice during the early time period in particular, where there would be kind of two businesses like that, or were they in any way connected? I mean, I kind of think about the building of caskets maybe is connected to furniture. Was that a common practice, or how did that kind of relationship develop?
Well, early on, when undertakers were first becoming undertakers, when men looked after some of the business rather than just the family and somebody on a farm in a rural area that wasn't connected. But it did start with cabinet makers who made caskets or coffins for people when they died. And some of those cabinet makers did evolve into furniture makers. But when the funeral homes and the retail furniture stores were together, by then they were buying furniture and caskets from manufacturing companies. And this is like 1870s, 1880s. They weren't making their own furniture. But the reason that they had the two businesses was they needed another source of income, because especially in small communities, there weren't enough deaths to make a living on. That's the most common combination, the furniture and funeral, but some of the ones that I've researched and are in the cities did picture framing. One man he was a glove manufacturer, so like not connected at all, but another way for an income.
Interesting. No, I have to ask, I mean, that's a very unique family business that several generations of your family have been involved in, and dealing with death on a very day-to-day basis that most of us were scared to think of death or only want to engage with the topic when we have to. Or how do you think it affected your family's perception of death, being that close to it? Was it really just kind of an everyday thing? Or how do you picture the difference, I guess, between your family and other people in the society in regards to everything that surrounds death and dying?
Well, that's kind of a hard one because I don't know what other families, it's my experience has been this. But in just, talking with other people and I totally agree with what you're saying, because there's a mystique about it. When my sister was first working as an apprentice at the furniture and funeral business, when she was still in high school, I think, in her last year. And she said how Mom told her, don't tell any of your friends what you do here. So there was that secrecy. Contrast that to many years later, and my sister has tours of the funeral home for school kids and takes them through and shows them the embalming room or the preparation room, which I think other funeral homes do too, but it's just very different from 30 or 40 years before that. But for the feeling about death and dealing with that all the time, when I interviewed the funeral directors, a lot of them commented on that, and they had really interesting comments. The gist of it is you know that any minute could be your last, for one thing. You're always dealing with, or often dealing with, tragedies and sudden deaths. So there's that to it. For me, I guess I have realized that my perspective is unique to some, and that's just because I'm familiar with it. There's not a mystique to it, and it's kind of hard to explain it. But as a child, as I had said before, I was used to seeing people in caskets, and that's what happened when people died. And I was also used to funeral and burial traditions of, we have a fairly large Mennonite community around Elmira. And so their traditions were different. They have a different casket. Their clothes burial clothes are different, and they still have visitations in their homes. And really, that's kind of like it was 150 years ago. It's not that they're different now, but they weren't different at that time. So that was familiar to me too, and that's partly why I also wrote about that. I don't know what other people would think, but funeral directors are much like pastors. Their work is a calling to them. They have a passion about it. They're serving the community. They're serving everybody in the community. So it was really interesting to hear them talk about it that way. Probably what would appear as my attitude being unique is that I'm comfortable in the funeral home, which a lot of people aren't. They don't want to be there. Somebody that they've loved has died, and it's a terrible time. But for me, because it's family and I've grown up in it, it's a place of comfort for me when somebody has died, when somebody in the family has died.
Now, I have to ask, as of course, our listeners are very interested in kind of the paranormal, of course. And funeral homes are very interesting, I think, because we often associate ghost stories in places of significant trauma, places where people have actually died or passed away. And in funeral homes, of course, that's not the case. The bodies may arrive there, but it's not the place necessarily, almost always, I assume, of death itself. But I have to ask, dealing with bodies all the time and all the work involved in prepping them for services and things like that, I imagine it could get a little eerie at times. Or maybe not, maybe it's too commonplace, but in your family, are there any kind of spooky stories involved in kind of the day-to-day work that seep through?
Well, I think that people on the outside, not involved with funeral service, thinks everything about it is spooky. But not really. When people have commented about being haunted, I said, as you said, that, okay, the people have died before they get here. So in my mind, it's where they died that the haunting or whatever would occur. We didn't really talk that much about the embalming, partly because, as I said before, it was kind of a topic you just didn't talk about and didn't want to talk to others about. I know that there was, and this would be in the 40s, late 40s, 1940s, that there was a multiple murder in a community nearby. And there were, I think, 4 or 5 bodies that were at the funeral home at one time. And my mom said that people asked her, aren't you afraid? And this would probably apply for any time, but they said, aren't you afraid of being around those dead bodies? And she said, I feel a lot safer around them than I do some live people.
It's a good line.
Yeah, well, it's probably very, very true. The only other kind of story that I would have is somebody in the family, I don't know, where it came from or when, but at one point I heard that my uncle was in the preparation room and probably with an apprentice, because Dreisingers had apprentices or interns a lot of the time, ones that wanted to be a funeral director, and they had to spend a year or part of a year or two working in a funeral home. And they did that a lot. When they were starting to prepare the body, the arm moved, which I don't think is unusual. But my uncle, who likes to tease, probably saw his chance, and he said, okay, well, watch their eyes, and if they move, run like hell. So that's kind of the limit of that type of stories that I have.
Turning back to your book, Death as Life's Work, you've mentioned a little bit of your family history, and obviously that being a motivation to write the book. I know it's a huge task undergoing this type of historical research. What were your other motivating factors in wanting to spend so much time and energy on this particular topic?
I had been writing about the business. I wrote a few stories for the Waterloo Historical Society volume, which is an annual volume. I put together a book in 2013 about the Dreisinger funeral vehicles. I had a lot of pictures, and it was almost like a catalog for me to have those pictures and information with them. And then I was looking for information about my great-grandfather's business in Waterloo and Kitchener after I found out about it. And I couldn't find anything in the local history books that had already been written about them, or actually about very many undertakers or funeral businesses. They weren't mentioned that much in the books. And I thought, I didn't understand that a business that affects everybody's life wouldn't have more mention in history books. So I thought, I'm going to fill that gap. I started collecting information. I didn't really have a book in mind, but I started collecting information, and people that knew that I was doing that also sent me information too. And I was given the chance to apply for a research fellowship that was for a year. And so I decided to do that on funeral business histories and practices, which practices weren't really my thing. I realized I wasn't as interested in as I said, the embalming or that kind of thing. I was more interested in the histories, and that what hadn't been written about. So I did that fellowship, and at some point in the year, I thought, I've got a lot of good material here. Maybe I can go ahead with a book. So I decided that I would. And it was about 8 years ago, because it's been about 8 years since I decided and started writing the book.
I know you've shared some really interesting pictures of funeral vehicles, if we can call that a topic or a grouping. Would it be possible for you to share us a little bit of the evolution that's been involved in the vehicles, just the very broad strokes from, I guess, the earliest days that you've looked at up to more recent? Because it's something we may take for granted, but I assume that's changed quite a bit over time.
Yes, some of the older records, of course, are pictures of horse-drawn hearses. I can remember seeing a very plain, almost just a box for a hearse on runners for a sled in the Dreisinger barn. And so they would have needed that in the winter to pick up the bodies. And even after motor vehicles came into use, we used to have a lot more snow than we do now, and probably in some areas they still have a lot, but the cars couldn't get to the farms and even to the houses in town. So they used those sleighs for a long time. I would say probably the 1930s and 40s still. When the motor vehicles came to be used, they were very, very fancy. Not garish, but the sides were wooden on the early ones and were carved. And they had beautiful carvings. There were some vehicle makers, I think there was one in Ingersoll, a cabinet maker could make the sides. In fact, there was one that did make the first one that Dreisingers had. And then they were on other chassis like Studebakers, Packards, Henneys, different chassis, and sometimes the company themselves would build the body, and other times it would be two different companies. And then as vehicles evolved, so did the funeral vehicles. Something that a lot of people don't know is early on, like when they were still the motor hearses, but usually the funeral services were in the home and then in the church, and then they would walk to the cemetery, and they would walk behind the hearse. So I have a picture of that. And that was fairly common. And well, they did that with the horse-drawn ones too. So that was a continuation.
Now, one of my favorite parts of doing historical research is you never know what you're going to find, and it's often surprising or completely unexpected. And I know your research has uncovered a lot of very fascinating artifacts. And I wonder if you could share with us a few of the most interesting or your favorites that you've come across in your work.
I've been very fortunate because I have a lot of the Dreisinger records and some artifacts, but other people have given me items also that from their private collections. So talking about the ledgers, I have those or copies of them. The earliest one I have was actually just a notebook, like a 4 inches by 2 inches kind of notebook that I assume would have been taken along when they picked up the body, just to record the details that they needed. I've also been given access to ledgers from 2 other funeral businesses that closed many years ago. And there aren't a lot of those ledgers left because the information was confidential. I think they destroyed the ledgers, or somebody bought them and they're in other people's collections. One, and this is probably my favorite, was a diary, and this was 1915, and it was a father who was grieving the death of their firstborn, a daughter who died suddenly. And he wrote in his work, it was just his work notebook where he had kept track of his hours, his work hours, and where he was working. And it's very unusual for a man to keep a diary at that time, and also to express emotion. And he just poured his heart out in this notebook. And it still almost makes me cry to talk about it. So it was a very, very sad time. And he wrote for maybe 3 or 4 months after she died, and then it stopped. And that was all. There was no more. I guess it was over. And I transcribed it and I photographed some of the pages. So that's in the book. He also had a beautiful framed picture of the child that was taken after she died. And so I included that, a picture of that also. And it was partly, it was something different to include, but for me, it was a way of remembering her because she was the firstborn of a family of 12. She had no marker. And by the time the other 11 died, which was many years later for most of them, but she wasn't mentioned in their obituaries as a predeceased by. And I thought, oh, that's just sad. So anyway, I was glad to remember her. Her name was Merle. Another thing is when you think of embalming fluid, you likely picture bottles from suppliers. Now, am I right about that? Yeah, I thought so, but I wasn't sure. But some undertakers made their own, and they had recipes, and more than one recipe, depending on the condition of the body, I guess, or what the cause of death was. At the Dreisinger building, which was a really old building, tacked to one of the huge basement beams was a recipe that my grandfather used. Well, I don't have the actual recipe, but I have a copy of it. Another family member has it. My grandfather used this recipe, and a niece remembered his rough red hands, supposedly from mixing ingredients and not wearing gloves. And this is formaldehyde, and yeah. So, but he lived a fairly long life. The ingredients, which you're probably curious about, were alcohol, water, glycerin, and formaldehyde. The measurements are in gallons and half gallons. So I don't know how long he made it or how often he used it. I just know that recipe was there. And in the funeral ledgers, it also showed purchases of embalming fluid from manufacturers. So, as I said, I'm not sure why he used it, or if that was really just earlier on. And you may wonder what they used to mix gallons of ingredients. There was a man in another community that also had a notebook with several recipes, and some were for skin conditions, like to prepare the skin. And I have seen his notebooks too. So I don't know what they used, but a friend of mine who's has a funeral director in the family, her relatives said they used a wringer washing machine in the basement. So they put the ingredients in, turn it on, give it a swish, turn on the motor for the agitator, open the drainage spigot, and let it pour into large bottles. I've got a picture of a bottle, and it would be a good 24 inches or more high and maybe a foot wide. So those are my favorites.
It's a bit of a slight variation on the usual family recipes we talk about in our day-to-day life. But what occurs to me, thinking about the homemade embalming fluid, or even the wood carving on some of the sides of the vehicles, or the casket itself, not surprising in the kind of corporate world we live in today, but it really seemed to have, I don't know if personal touch is the right word, but with all of those things taking place kind of under the same roof, is that a change for the better, this kind of commercialization, this standardization in funeral practices? Or do you think anything's been lost with having these, I would say, craftspeople of various job titles involved in the process? I'd be curious what you think about that.
In some ways, what goes around comes around, because the funeral service, I think, and it still is, but was very personalized, as you're talking about. And then as it grew, it became more cold and distant from the families, if I can say it that way. Now there's a lot more doing things the way people want it. It can be very different if you want to have different music, or if you've said you don't want to wear a suit in the casket, you can have jeans or whatever. So just as a small example, that change is coming back. But I think when you talk about craftsmen, first of all, the population was a lot smaller, and most people, there were more craftsmen. But the people that do things now, you can look at them as craftsmen also. The cars, the caskets, although some of the caskets are still handmade, the ones in some of the Mennonite communities, and others. Some people now are making their own caskets. The embalming fluids, the makeup, kind of on the periphery, but you still have the undertaker and funeral director who's dealing with the family. And in my mind, that's a constant, and that's pretty much the same. You have one-on-one and that personal interaction.
Now, one of the best ways we learn or come to understand things is, of course, by comparison. And as we have little experience in general, I think, with the funeral business, and certainly historically, are there any other unique historical practices or traditions that you think would surprise our listeners to hear about today?
One of the things was as I mentioned, the Mennonite communities around Elmira, and their funeral and burial traditions, of some of them, are different. Their caskets are plain wood covered with black material. The cushioning is soft wood shaving called excelsior, not the cushions. Their burial clothes are called shrouds, and they're made by women within their group. The caskets are also made by men in the group, but some of the same caskets are manufactured. So it depends what they want, but they are made. The visitations are in their homes. And the different traditions of 7 of the Mennonite groups in our area became a separate book. While I was working on Death as Life's Work, I decided I would separate the information about the Mennonite group. So that became a separate book in 2019. Even people in this area who are used to seeing Mennonite people who are dressed differently, there are Mennonites who don't dress differently, they don't know their funeral and burial traditions, or they don't know that much. They see the horse and buggies, because they do still use horse and buggies. They see them going to church or going to a funeral. But the other part, I found that they didn't know. Another thing was not directly related to the funeral business. It would have affected everybody, but when there was a change in telephone service, and this is in the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s, and in some rural areas, one telephone line served multiple homes and businesses until the 1960s. So imagine sharing your telephone line with 7 other people, because they could have up to 8 families on the line. They called it a party line, and I'm not sure why. I don't think they used it for parties, but and they had different numbers, and an operator used a cord board that plugged a connection in to whatever home was being, or whatever home or business was being called. I realize this is a long time ago for some people, but some of the undertakers, funeral directors that I interviewed were in their 80s. And so this is how it was for them back then, and they experienced these changes. So that's how they received a telephone call, which was, that's the way it was. If they wanted to visit friends, they would tell the operator, well, I'm going to so-and-so, so if there's a call for me, she could just plug it into the friend's place and their phone would ring. So that was like an answering service. And then dial phones came to be. It's probably another expression that would need explaining for some, but when dial phones were installed and before answering services came to be, it meant that someone had to be available on the funeral home premises 24/7. Like they couldn't leave because they could get a call day or night. So they didn't quite have the same freedom. People talk about costs of caskets and vehicles and cost of funerals and that, but some of the charges back then I'm talking early 1900s to whatever, 1940s, 50s, some of the charges would be similar now, but of course they would be a lot more now than they were then. But back then, in the ledgers that I've seen, the charges seem very different. They charged for every little thing was shown separately. So an example would be the different carriages that they had, because they also provided carriages for people to be driven to the church or wherever. Horse and sleigh. Shipping by train. If the person died in another city or province or in the US, the body had to be brought back, and the only way was by train. They were also charged pillows, underwear, and socks. So I'm not sure why that was, but it's on some of those charges. Cemetery equipment, sound system, use of the chapel, telegrams, flower stands, shoveling, which would be for the grave. It seems like minutia now, but that's how they were charged. The last thing is that people probably don't realize or would be surprised at is the collaboration amongst funeral home owners. And I'm talking rural areas, small cities and towns. So in Toronto, Montreal, whatever, I don't know if that would be the same, but I would think early on it might have been. When motor hearses replaced horse-drawn, not everyone could afford motor hearses. And some, like my great-grandfather, rented hearses and cars to area funeral homes. And that continued for Dreisingers to about the 1990s. So it was a business and it was rented, but still the driver would take part in the funeral service at the other funeral home. And so they were all working together. One ad said that we had 2 sets of vehicles. And I remember watching the men park the big black cars and hearses on an angle within inches of each other in the garage. Another example of the collaboration is in interviews with my sister Grace Mahar and some of the older funeral directors. They especially noted the lack of competition. You helped when needed, especially small establishments. That could be for a removal, which is bringing the body to the funeral home from where they had died. They were on call for one another if one went on vacation or was sick, perhaps. If a family wanted a casket, and at that time they had caskets in stock, up until a few years ago, there were large casket rooms. Now they don't as much. But if a family wanted a casket that the funeral director didn't have, he would call the salesman or call another funeral home. And if he called the salesman, he would call the funeral home and see if they had one, and then would have it brought to the person that wanted it, and then replace it later. So that was a way of helping each other. Some did embalming for other funeral homes too, and for some it was added income to do that. And all of those tasks were charged for, but they still knew that they had people that they could count on, and that they could be in competition because there could be more than one funeral home in a community.
One point you've made today, which I think is quite interesting and probably gets taken for granted, except when we are in those personal moments of grief, I think is the community service aspect that's provided by funeral homes at the most difficult times. So it almost feels like we need to thank a funeral director and their teams today in recognition for all they do for us, really when we need them the most. So I thank you for your historical research and the context you've provided to us to understand a little bit more about this as a business and as a family business as well. If our listeners are interested in getting a copy of the book, where can they find it? And are you online in other places that they could follow you and keep up with your exploits?
Yes, I am online. I'm on Twitter. It's at Marion Roes, MarionRoes. And that is mostly with undertaking information, pictures and that, but I do have other things on there too. And I'm also on Facebook, and the Facebook name is Undertakers and Their Businesses in Waterloo Region. I was never good at short titles. And to get the book from me, you'd have to contact me. It is in bookstores in this area, in Kitchener, Waterloo, and Elmira, but it's not online. So the best way is to contact me. It's at my email, which is mlroes@simpatico.ca. I have the books for sale, and I can mail within Canada and the US.
Well, Marion, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I hope we can catch up again soon.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Jim. I enjoyed this.
A very special thank you to Marion Roes for joining us, and congratulations to her on the publication of her book. I know a lot of time and love go into those projects. And of course, thank you for joining us. For information about our upcoming virtual haunted campfires, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all 4 at Haunted Walk. And once again, those 2 really easy ways to help the show are to leave a 5-star review for us wherever you listen, and to recommend the show to family, friends, and anyone who has a love of things that go bump in the night. As always, a heartfelt thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.